In the remote hills of Montana, where vast stretches of wilderness can hide secrets for generations, and where economic survival depends on making the most of whatever the land provides, there are stories that seem too extraordinary to be true. For some ranchers, the difference between prosperity and poverty can hinge on a single discovery, a moment of luck that transforms everything they thought they knew about their property and their future. This is the story of Connor Walsh, a 43-year-old cattle rancher whose modest operation had barely kept him afloat for 2 decades, and the extraordinary find that would transform him from a struggling landowner into one of the wealthiest men in Big Sky country. When a routine maintenance project on his remote property led to the discovery of something that had been hidden beneath Montana's soil for over a century, Connor's life changed in ways that challenged everything he believed about luck, responsibility, and what it truly means to strike it rich. Sometimes fortune favors not just the bold, but those who are willing to dig deeper when everyone else would walk away. And sometimes the greatest wealth lies not in what we can see above ground, but in the mysteries that wait patiently beneath our feet. Before we dive into this remarkable story of discovery and transformation, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love connecting with our viewers around the world. The struggling ranch. Connor Walsh stood on the front porch of his weathered ranch house, surveying the 1,500 acres of Montana grassland that had been his home and livelihood for the past 20 years. At 43, Connor possessed the lean, weathered appearance of someone who had spent most of his adult life working outdoors in one of America's most challenging environments. But he also carried the weight of constant financial worry that came with operating a small cattle ranch in an increasingly difficult agricultural economy. The Walsh Ranch had never been a large operation by Montana standards, but it had always been sufficient to provide Connor with a modest living and the independence that came with working his own land. He ran about 200 head of cattle on his property, which bordered the Beartooth National Forest and provided some of the most beautiful and isolated grazing land in the state. The nearest town, Red Lodge, was a 40-minute drive over mountain roads that became treacherous during winter storms, and his closest neighbor lived 8 miles away across a valley that could be impassable for weeks at a time. But Connor's isolation, which he had always viewed as one of the ranch's greatest assets, was becoming increasingly problematic as economic pressures mounted and the costs of running a cattle operation continued to rise faster than beef prices. Feed costs had increased dramatically over the past few years. Veterinary expenses seemed to climb every season, and the equipment necessary to maintain his operation required constant repair or replacement that strained his limited budget. On this particular September morning, Connor was reviewing bills that had accumulated over the summer, payments for hay, veterinary services, equipment repairs, and property taxes that collectively represented more money than his cattle operation had generated in the past 6 months. The numbers were discouraging no matter how he calculated them, and Connor was beginning to face the possibility that he might need to sell part of his herd or even consider selling portions of his land to maintain financial stability. The situation had become particularly acute since the failure of his well pump 3 weeks earlier. The pump that provided water for his cattle had been installed nearly 30 years ago by the ranch's previous owner, and its sudden breakdown had created an emergency that required immediate attention regardless of cost. Connor had been forced to truck water to his cattle while waiting for replacement parts that took 2 weeks to arrive and cost nearly $3,000 to purchase and install. But it was during the installation of the new water system that Connor made a discovery that would change his life forever. The well pump was located in a remote section of his property, about 2 miles from the main ranch buildings, in an area that Connor rarely visited except for maintenance purposes. The terrain around the well was rough and rocky, with scattered boulders and scraggly pine trees that had somehow managed to survive in soil that was too thin and rocky to support most vegetation. When the pump installation crew arrived to dig the new well, their equipment encountered something unexpected about 6 feet below the surface. The drilling had proceeded normally until the auger hit what appeared to be a large, solid object that was clearly not a natural rock formation. Initial attempts to drill around the obstruction were unsuccessful, as whatever they had encountered seemed to extend in multiple directions beneath the surface. "Mr. Walsh," called out Mike Rodriguez, the crew foreman who had been installing water systems throughout Montana for over 15 years, "we've got a problem here. There's something big buried down there, and we can't get around it to complete the well installation." Connor walked over to examine the drilling site, noting that the crew had exposed what appeared to be the corner of some kind of structure made of wood and metal that had been buried beneath several feet of soil and rock. "Any idea what it might be?" Connor asked, though he suspected that Mike had as little experience with mysterious buried objects as he did. "Could be an old septic system. Maybe a storage tank or root cellar that someone built and then abandoned," Mike replied. "But it's bigger than anything I've usually seen, and it's built too solid for most normal purposes." Connor studied the exposed portion of the buried structure, noting that the visible wood appeared to be much older than anything that should have been on his property, and that the construction method seemed more elaborate than would have been necessary for simple storage or waste management. How much would it cost to excavate around it enough to complete the well installation? Connor asked, though he suspected that the answer would strain his already tight budget. "Probably about $1,000 for the excavation, assuming we don't run into more complications," Mike replied. "But Mr. Walsh, if I were you, I'd want to know what this thing is before I started digging around it. Could be something that affects your property value, or could be something that creates legal complications if it's historical or archaeological." Connor felt his stomach clench at the mention of potential legal complications. The last thing he needed was to discover that his property contained something that would attract government attention or create restrictions on his ability to use his own land. But curiosity, combined with the practical necessity of completing his water system installation, compelled Connor to authorize the excavation. Over the following day, Mike's crew carefully removed soil and rock from around the buried structure, revealing what appeared to be a wooden building that had been deliberately buried beneath several feet of carefully placed fill dirt. As more of the structure was exposed, Connor began to realize that what they had found was far more significant than an abandoned storage facility. The building was approximately 12 feet by 20 feet, constructed of heavy timber with metal reinforcements, and appeared to have been designed for long-term preservation rather than temporary use. Most intriguingly, the structure appeared to have been sealed with tar and wax, suggesting that someone had taken considerable care to protect whatever was inside from moisture and deterioration. "Mr. Walsh," Mike said as the excavation neared completion, "I think you need to see this." Connor climbed down into the excavation pit and examined the fully exposed structure, noting that it bore markings and construction details that suggested it was much older than anything that should have been on his property. According to his research of the ranch's history, the land had been homesteaded in the 1890s and had been used primarily for cattle ranching since that time. There was no record of any structures being built and then deliberately buried. But perhaps most remarkably, the building appeared to have been constructed with a sophisticated ventilation system and multiple chambers, suggesting that it had been designed to house something valuable that required protection from the elements and unauthorized access. Connor spent that evening researching the history of his property and the surrounding area, trying to understand what might have led someone to construct and bury such an elaborate structure in one of the most remote locations in Montana. What he discovered in local historical records was fragmentary but intriguing. According to documents in the Red Lodge Historical Society, the area around his ranch had been used during the late 1800s as a hideout and supply depot by various groups who needed secure storage in locations that were unlikely to be discovered by law enforcement or competitors. The region's isolation, combined with its proximity to multiple transportation routes through the mountains, had made it attractive to everyone, from fur trappers to gold prospectors to less law-abiding individuals who needed secure places to store valuable items. But Connor also understood that whatever he had found represented both an opportunity and a potential problem. If the buried structure contained something of historical or monetary value, he might have stumbled upon a discovery that could solve his financial problems. But he also knew that significant discoveries often came with complications that could be more challenging than the financial difficulties he was already facing. As Connor prepared for bed that night, looking out at the excavation site that was illuminated by floodlights his crew had installed, he realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet predict. The routine water pump replacement that was supposed to solve a simple maintenance problem had evolved into something that might transform his understanding of his property and his future. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to open the buried structure and discover what secrets it had been protecting for over a century. The discovery. Connor woke before dawn the next morning with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that had kept him tossing and turning through most of the night. The buried structure in his north pasture represented either the solution to his financial problems or the beginning of complications he wasn't prepared to handle. But curiosity and practical necessity compelled him to investigate further, regardless of what he might find. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern mountains, Connor was at the excavation site with tools from his workshop, trying to determine the best way to open the buried building without damaging whatever might be inside. The structure appeared to have been sealed at multiple points, and Connor could see that considerable effort had been taken to ensure that it would remain watertight and secure for an extended period. Using crowbars and other tools, Connor carefully removed what appeared to be the main entrance seal, a heavy wooden door that had been secured with multiple metal bars and sealed with tar and wax. As the seal broke and the door swung open, Connor was struck by a rush of air that smelled of old wood, metal, and something else he couldn't identify, but which suggested that the interior had been preserved in remarkably good condition. Connor retrieved a flashlight from his truck and stepped into the buried structure, immediately understanding that what he had found was far more significant than any storage facility or root cellar. The interior of the building was divided into multiple rooms, each of which appeared to have been designed for specific purposes. The main room contained what looked like office furniture, desks, chairs, and filing cabinets that appeared to date from the late 1800s, but were in remarkably good condition due to the controlled environment. But it was the contents of the filing cabinets and storage containers that took Connor's breath away. The first cabinet Connor opened contained hundreds of documents, maps, and photographs that appeared to chronicle the activities of some kind of business operation that had been based in this underground facility. As Connor examined the papers, a picture began to emerge of what he had discovered. According to the documents, the buried structure had been the headquarters of what was called the Montana Mineral Consortium, an organization that had operated throughout the northern Rocky Mountains during the 1880s and 1890s. The consortium appeared to have been involved in various mining and trading activities, but the documents suggested that their operations had been considerably more extensive and profitable than typical mining ventures of that era. Connor spent several hours reading through business records, correspondence, and financial documents that painted a picture of an operation that had generated enormous wealth through a combination of legitimate mining claims and more questionable activities that involved moving valuable items through remote mountain locations. The consortium had apparently chosen Connor's property as their headquarters because of its isolation and its proximity to transportation routes that allowed them to move materials and personnel without attracting attention from competitors or law enforcement. But perhaps most remarkably, the documents indicated that the consortium had used the buried facility not just as an office, but as a secure storage location for valuable items that they had accumulated through their various activities. According to inventory lists that Connor found in multiple filing cabinets, the facility had been used to store gold, silver, precious stones, and other valuable items that represented the accumulated wealth of the consortium's operations. Connor's hands trembled as he read through inventory sheets that listed hundreds of items with estimated values that seemed almost impossible to believe. According to the documents, the storage rooms in the buried facility contained gold bars, silver coins, uncut precious stones, and various other valuable items that collectively represented millions of dollars in current values. But Connor also understood that finding documentation of valuable items and actually finding the items themselves were two different things. The consortium had apparently operated over a century ago, and there was no guarantee that whatever they had stored in this facility hadn't been removed long before Connor discovered it. It was with considerable anxiety that Connor opened the door to the first storage room indicated on the consortium's inventory sheets. What he found exceeded his wildest imagination. The room was lined with wooden shelves and metal strongboxes that contained exactly what the inventory documents had promised. Gold bars stamped with the consortium's marking filled multiple containers, while canvas bags held thousands of silver coins that had been carefully preserved in oiled cloth. Glass jars contained uncut precious stones of various types and sizes, and wooden crates held what appeared to be jewelry, decorative items, and other valuable objects that the consortium had accumulated through their activities. Connor spent the rest of the day moving through the facility's multiple storage rooms, each of which contained similar collections of valuable items that corresponded to the inventory documents. By the time evening arrived, Connor had confirmed that he had discovered what was probably the largest cache of 19th century wealth ever found in Montana. But Connor also understood that his discovery created challenges that were almost as significant as the opportunities it represented. He was now in possession of items worth millions of dollars, but he had no idea how to convert that wealth into practical benefits while managing the legal, tax, and security complications that would inevitably arise from such a discovery. That evening, Connor called his lawyer, Patricia Miller, who had handled the ranch's legal affairs for over a decade. Patricia was a practical woman who specialized in agricultural and property law, but Connor suspected that his situation was going to require expertise that extended far beyond her usual practice areas. "Connor," Patricia said after listening to his description of the discovery, "you need to understand that what you've found creates both tremendous opportunities and serious potential problems. On one hand, items found on your own property generally belong to you under Montana law. On the other hand, discoveries of this magnitude often attract attention from various government agencies, potential claimants, and other parties who may have legal or financial interests in what you found." "What do you recommend?" Connor asked. "First, you need to have the items professionally appraised to determine their actual value and authenticity. Second, you need to research whether there are any existing legal claims on the materials or the property. Third, you need to develop a plan for securing and managing the items while you decide how to proceed." Connor spent a sleepless night considering Patricia's advice and trying to understand the full implications of his discovery. The buried facility on his property contained enough wealth to solve all his financial problems and transform him into one of the richest individuals in Montana. But managing that wealth responsibly would require skills and expertise that he didn't currently possess. Over the following days, Connor contacted specialists in various fields who could help him understand and manage his discovery. He arranged for visits from an appraiser who specialized in 19th century precious metals and gems, a historian who could research the legal and historical background of the Montana Mineral Consortium, and a financial advisor who could help him develop strategies for managing sudden wealth. But Connor also understood that his story was just beginning. The discovery that had solved his immediate financial problems was also going to change his life in ways that he couldn't yet predict, and he would need to learn quickly how to navigate challenges and opportunities that few people ever had to face. The lonely rancher who had been struggling to pay his bills had become the owner of one of the largest treasure caches in American history, but Connor was beginning to understand that managing great wealth might be even more challenging than living without it. Managing fortune. 2 months after Connor's discovery, his life had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible when he was struggling to pay for a new well pump. The initial professional appraisal of the Montana Mineral Consortium's cache had confirmed that Connor had found items worth approximately $12 million, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in Montana virtually overnight. But Connor was also learning that sudden wealth brought challenges and responsibilities that were almost as overwhelming as the financial struggles he had left behind. The transformation of Connor's situation had required assembling a team of professionals who specialized in managing the complex issues that arose from significant archaeological and financial discoveries. Patricia Miller had connected him with experts in tax law, historical preservation, security management, and financial planning, who collectively were helping him navigate the maze of legal and practical considerations that came with his newfound wealth. The most immediate challenge had been ensuring the security of the discovered items, while Connor decided how to manage them long-term. The remote location of his ranch, which had once been a disadvantage from a business perspective, had become an asset when it came to maintaining privacy and security around his discovery. Connor had hired a specialized security company to install systems that would protect both his property and the valuable items it contained, while also working with legal experts to ensure that his ownership rights were properly documented and protected. But perhaps the most complex aspect of managing his discovery was deciding how to balance his personal financial needs with his responsibilities to historical preservation and community benefit. The Montana Mineral Consortium's cache wasn't just valuable, it was also historically significant, providing insight into economic activities and social networks that had operated throughout the Rocky Mountain region during the late 19th century. "Connor," said Dr. Robert Chen, the historian Connor had hired to research the consortium's background during a meeting in Connor's now renovated ranch house. "What you found is more than just a treasure cache. It's a window into a whole network of economic and social relationships that historians didn't know existed. The consortium's records document activities that extended from Canada to Mexico and involved hundreds of people who were participating in various forms of legitimate and illegitimate commerce." Connor nodded, understanding that Dr. Chen was building toward a recommendation about how to handle the historical aspects of his discovery. "I think you should consider establishing a foundation that would preserve the historical materials while allowing you to benefit financially from the valuable items," Dr. Chen continued. "That would provide tax benefits, ensure that the historical materials are properly preserved and studied, and create a legacy that goes beyond just personal wealth." Connor had been expecting such a recommendation, and he had already begun discussing the possibility with his financial advisors and tax lawyers. The foundation structure would allow him to maintain control over his discovery while also providing benefits to the broader community and ensuring that the historical significance of his find was properly recognized and preserved. But Connor was also dealing with more immediate challenges related to public attention and community reaction to his sudden transformation from struggling rancher to multimillionaire. Word of his discovery had inevitably spread throughout the Red Lodge area despite his efforts to maintain privacy, and Connor was finding that sudden wealth had changed how people related to him in ways that were often uncomfortable and occasionally problematic. "Connor," said his neighbor Pete Johnson during an unexpected visit to the ranch, "I heard about your big discovery. Thought maybe you might be interested in investing in some local business opportunities." Connor had been receiving similar approaches almost daily since news of his find had begun circulating through the community. Friends, neighbors, and complete strangers had all developed investment opportunities, business proposals, and personal financial needs that they believed Connor's newfound wealth could address. "Pete," Connor replied, "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I'm still working with advisors to understand how to manage this situation responsibly. I'm not ready to make investment decisions yet." "But you got all that money just sitting there," Pete persisted. "Seems like you could help out some of the folks who've been your neighbors and friends for years." Connor was discovering that one of the most difficult aspects of sudden wealth was managing relationships with people who had known him before his discovery. Some friends and neighbors seemed to expect that his good fortune should automatically translate into benefits for them, while others appeared to resent his transformation from peer to wealthy individual. The situation had become particularly challenging with regard to Connor's romantic life. He had been single for several years before his discovery, partly due to the isolation of ranch life, and partly because his financial struggles had made him reluctant to pursue relationships that might create additional financial pressures. But his newfound wealth had apparently made him more attractive to potential partners in ways that made him question people's motivations and sincerity. "Connor," said Linda Martinez, a woman he had dated briefly several years earlier, but who had recently begun calling him regularly, "I've been thinking about how much we had in common. Maybe we should get together for dinner and talk about old times." Connor understood that Linda's renewed interest probably had more to do with his financial transformation than with any genuine desire to rekindle their relationship. But distinguishing between sincere interest and gold-digging behavior was proving to be more difficult than he had expected. These social complications were part of why Connor was increasingly interested in Dr. Chen's suggestion about establishing a foundation, creating a formal structure for managing his wealth and its community impact would allow him to make systematic decisions about how to use his resources rather than responding to individual requests and pressures. Working with his team of advisors, Connor developed a plan that would allow him to maintain control over his discovery, while also creating benefits for his community and ensuring proper preservation of the historical materials. The Connor Walsh Historical Preservation Foundation would purchase the most historically significant items from Connor's personal collection, providing him with liquid assets while ensuring that the materials were properly preserved and made available to researchers and the general public. The foundation would also establish a research center on Connor's ranch, creating jobs for local residents while attracting visitors and researchers who would contribute to the area's economic development. Additionally, the foundation would provide grants for historical preservation and education projects throughout Montana, ensuring that Connor's discovery created lasting benefits that extended far beyond his personal financial situation. 6 months after his initial discovery, Connor stood in what had once been his modest ranch house, but was now the headquarters of both his personal residence and the foundation that managed his historical collection. The building had been expanded and renovated to include office space, secure storage facilities, and meeting areas where researchers could study the consortium's documents and artifacts. "Connor," said Margaret Foster, the Foundation's executive director, whom Connor had hired to manage the day-to-day operations. "The first group of researchers from the University of Montana will be arriving next week to begin their study of the consortium's financial records. We've also received inquiries from historians in Canada and Mexico who are interested in the materials that document the consortium's international activities." Connor nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction that his discovery was creating opportunities for learning and research that would continue for years to come. But he was also pleased that his personal financial situation had been resolved in ways that allowed him to maintain his ranch operations while also pursuing new opportunities. The struggling cattle operation that had barely kept him afloat was now one component of a diversified enterprise that included the foundation, a growing tourism business centered around the historical discovery, and investment activities that were generating substantial ongoing income. Connor had not only solved his immediate financial problems, but had created a sustainable economic foundation that would support him for the rest of his life while also benefiting his community and contributing to historical knowledge. The lonely rancher who had been worried about paying his bills had become a wealthy philanthropist and historical preservationist. But Connor was discovering that the most satisfying aspect of his transformation was not the money itself, but the opportunities it created to make meaningful contributions to his community and to the understanding of Montana's rich historical heritage. The legacy transformed. 1 year after Connor's life-changing discovery, the Walsh Ranch had been transformed from a struggling cattle operation into one of Montana's most significant historical and educational destinations. The Connor Walsh Historical Preservation Foundation had become a model for how private discoveries could be managed to benefit both individuals and communities, while the research center established on his property was attracting scholars and visitors from around the world. On this particular morning in late September, exactly 1 year after Connor had first encountered the buried structure, he stood in the foundation's main building, reviewing plans for the next phase of development on his property. The modest ranch house had been expanded into a modern facility that included research libraries, artifact storage areas, and educational spaces that could accommodate visiting scholars, students, and tourists who came to learn about the Montana Mineral Consortium and its role in 19th-century Western economic development. "Connor," said Dr. Sarah Kim, the Foundation's chief historian, "the documentary crew from the History Channel has finished their filming, and they're very excited about the story. They think the episode about your discovery will be one of their most popular programs this season." Connor smiled, still somewhat amazed by the attention his discovery continued to attract from media organizations, educational institutions, and the general public. The story of his transformation from struggling rancher to wealthy philanthropist had captured imaginations far beyond Montana, and Connor was regularly invited to speak at conferences, universities, and historical societies about his experience and the lessons it offered about managing sudden wealth responsibly. But perhaps more satisfying than the attention was the impact that Connor's discovery was having on his local community and on historical research more broadly. The foundation had become one of the largest employers in the Red Lodge area, providing jobs for historians, tour guides, security personnel, and administrative staff who supported the various activities centered around the consortium's cash and documents. The economic benefits extended beyond direct employment. The research center and museum were attracting thousands of visitors annually, generating revenue for local hotels, restaurants, and other businesses that served tourists interested in Montana history and Western heritage. The Foundation's grant programs were also supporting historical preservation projects throughout the region, helping communities preserve their own historical resources and develop educational programs for their residents. "Connor," said Mayor Patricia Johnson during a meeting to discuss the Foundation's impact on the local community, "I want you to know that your discovery has transformed our entire economic outlook. We've gone from a community that was struggling to maintain basic services to one that's attracting investment and development because of the educational and cultural resources you've created." But Connor was perhaps most proud of the educational programs that the Foundation had developed. Working with Montana State University and other educational institutions, the foundation offered internships, research opportunities, and educational programs that allowed students to gain hands-on experience with historical research and preservation techniques. Many of these students were from Montana communities that had limited access to such opportunities, and Connor took particular satisfaction in knowing that his discovery was creating pathways for young people to pursue careers in history, archaeology, and related fields. The foundation was also pioneering new approaches to making historical materials accessible to the general public. Using digital technology, Connor's team had created online databases and virtual exhibits that allowed people around the world to explore the consortium's documents and artifacts without traveling to Montana. These digital resources were being used by schools, universities, and researchers in dozens of countries, extending the educational impact of Connor's discovery far beyond what would have been possible through traditional museum displays. "Dr. Kim," Connor said, as they reviewed the Foundation's annual report, "I'm amazed by how far this has all extended beyond what I originally imagined. When I first found that buried building, I was just hoping to solve my immediate financial problems. I never dreamed that it would turn into something that affects people all over the world." "That's what happens when you approach a significant discovery with vision and responsibility," Dr. Kim replied. "You could have simply sold everything to private collectors and walked away wealthy. Instead, you chose to create something that benefits everyone while also securing your own financial future." Connor had indeed secured his financial future, but in ways that extended far beyond simply converting historical artifacts into cash. The foundation structure had provided him with substantial tax benefits while also generating ongoing income through its various activities. The research center and museum were profitable enterprises in their own right, while the foundation's endowment was growing through careful investment management and continued donations from individuals and organizations who supported its mission. But perhaps most importantly, Connor had used his discovery to create a sustainable economic model that would continue generating benefits long after the initial excitement of the find had faded. The research center would continue attracting scholars and students for decades to come. The museum would remain a permanent tourist attraction, and the Foundation's grant programs would continue supporting historical preservation throughout Montana. Connor had also used his wealth to improve his own quality of life in ways that went beyond material comforts. The isolation that had once been a burden was now a choice, as Connor could afford to travel and participate in social activities that had been financially impossible when he was struggling with his ranch operation. He had developed relationships with historians, researchers, and other individuals who shared his interests in historical preservation and Western heritage. Most significantly, Connor had found purpose and meaning in his wealth that extended beyond personal comfort. The Foundation's work was contributing to human knowledge and understanding in ways that would persist long after Connor himself was gone, ensuring that his discovery would have lasting impact rather than simply representing a personal financial windfall. "Connor," said Jennifer Martinez, a graduate student who had been working at the Foundation for 6 months, "I wanted to thank you for creating these opportunities. I'm from a small town in eastern Montana, and without the internship program here, I never would have been able to pursue graduate work in history. Your discovery hasn't just changed your life, it's changing the lives of people like me who are getting chances we never would have had otherwise." As Connor looked back on the year since his discovery, he realized that the most valuable transformation hadn't been financial, but personal. The struggling rancher who had been focused primarily on survival had become someone who was contributing to his community and to the broader understanding of American history. The wealth he had found had provided him with resources, but more importantly, it had given him the opportunity to create something meaningful that would outlast his own lifetime. The secret that had been buried on his land for over a century had indeed made Connor rich, but it had also taught him that the greatest wealth comes not from what we can accumulate for ourselves, but from what we can create for others. The lonely rancher had become not just a wealthy man, but a philanthropist, educator and steward of history, whose legacy would inspire others for generations to come. This extraordinary story of Connor Walsh reminds us that true wealth isn't just about money, but about what we do with the opportunities that come our way. His journey from struggling rancher to philanthropist shows us that the greatest discoveries often lead not just to personal gain, but to contributions that benefit entire communities and future generations. When fortune finds us, we have choices about how to use it, and Connor's choice to create lasting value rather than simply enjoy personal luxury demonstrates the kind of vision that transforms lives far beyond our own. If this story inspired you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing stories about discovery, responsibility, and the power of using good fortune to benefit others. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and share your thoughts about how you would handle a life-changing discovery. Remember, we all have opportunities to make positive impacts with whatever resources we have, and sometimes the greatest treasures we can leave behind are the opportunities we create for others. Until next time, keep believing that extraordinary discoveries can lead to extraordinary contributions to the world around us.